So yeah, hello everyone. I'm Emily. I'm doing my PhD currently in my fourth year, so I'm in the process of wrapping up my experiments and hopefully I can submit by the end of September. So my background is in biology and specifically I've got an interest in plant and soil ecology. So currently at Sheffield, I'm based within Katie Field's lab. So we study a group of fungi or fungi, known as mycorrhizal fungi. Today I'm just going to talk a broad overview about some of the recent developments in our field. So fungi in general, they've had traditionally their positioning on the tree of life has been quite difficult. So initially they were thought to be sort of closer to plants and they were classed together with plants. It wasn't until the 19th century where they were considered like a distinct grouping. And more recently we place them within the eukaryota together with plants and animals, and we actually know that they are more related with animals than plants actually. There are about 150,000 species described, but their estimates range from 2 to 5 million species worldwide. So obviously we just know very little bit about them just because we know actually that most species are still unknown to us. So a group of fungi is these mycorrhizal fungi which we study. So they are about 1,000 species of these described, and their estimates range up to 10,000s of species that we think exist on our planet. So they basically form associations with plants on Earth, and the basic premise is that they exchange nutrients with plants. So they provide plant soil nutrients in return for sugars and lipids that we take from the plant in the form of carbon being sort of the product of photosynthesis. So there are three, again, their diversity and taxonomy is very complicated and every day it changes, and I'm not a taxonomist even, I should say. But generally, currently there are these fungal phyla, Basidiomycota, Ascomycota, and Mycorrhizal there. So all of these contain mycorrhizal fungi. The Basidiomycota are the ones, they're the phylum that contain most mushroom-making fungi. These are what you might see at a forest. And again, the mushroom is basically just the tip of the iceberg. It's the it contains the spores, with the majority of the organism actually living below ground in thread-like structures that we call hyphae. The Ascomycota, they contain the decomposers, so they are the ones that break down sort of dead materials. And also within that, we have the fungi that we use for like yeast that we use for beer or bread, and also the fungus that the beetles carry and then leads to Dutch elm disease, which has devastated a lot of trees in the UK and worldwide. And then finally, most of the mycorrhizal fungi are found within Mycorrhizal, but this phylum also includes other pathogenic fungi as well. Okay, so mycorrhizal fungi are also divided into other categories based on their taxonomy, but also their morphology and sort of some of their functional differences. So one grouping is the ectomycorrhizes. So these mostly form associations with trees, especially sort of more northern boreal areas. And again, these are the ones that usually form the mushrooms above ground. The other general category is the endomycorrhizes. So these are then further split into the ericoid mycorrhizes. So these are the ones that form associations with plants such as blueberry and heather. Then we also have the orchid mycorrhizes. So as the name suggests, these form associations with orchids. And also we have the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, which form associations with trees, but also herbaceous species. And these are probably the most widespread and also the most studied. And this is also the group that I mostly work on. So here it's quite small for you at the back, but basically this panel here is showing this what we call like a reciprocal exchange of nutrients, where phosphorus and nitrogen and also water in the soil can be acquired by these fungi and transferred to the plant host, and then carbon is transferred from the plant to the fungi. So in arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi in particular, this happens within the root cell. So this is the plant, the root cell, and then the fungi colonize the inside of the root. And this is where this nutrient for carbon exchange takes place. Obviously plants can survive, at least the vast majority can survive without mycorrhizal associations, but arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi in particular, we think that they are what we call obligate biotropes, which means that they rely entirely on plant nutrition for their survival. So going back to this panel, the next one here is basically showing fungal species, which it's an exception to the rule, but it can form two mycorrhizal associations. So a nectar mycorrhizal association with a tree and an orchid association with an orchid. This is showing the opposite, where trees such as poplar, for example, they form associations with exomycorrhizal fungi, but also arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. And finally, this panel here is showing the concept of a common mycorrhizal network. So this is basically when the fungus living below ground forms this thread-like structures known as hyphae, and when it connects to neighboring plants, it's called the common mycorrhizal network, and this has the potential to maybe facilitate exchange of signals or resources between the plants. So this is something I'll touch on more later on. Before that, I will just briefly talk about some of the ecological roles of mycorrhizal fungi. So the first one is nutrient cycling and soil health. The fungi in the soil, including mycorrhizal fungi, they are responsible for breaking down dead material, and that ultimately leads to the renewal of soil, which otherwise is a very slow process. Also, fungi release certain proteins, which basically act as glue, and they can help bind soil particles together. So this leads to soil aggregates, which are basically essential for what we call like a healthy soil, which can sustain like good crop production. And without these, we would basically get what is known as soil erosion, where basically soil particles break down, it sort of almost becomes dust, and this can be washed away by water or can be blown up in the air, and it can also create health problems if it's an extreme case. Another way that fungi influence our ecosystems is obviously through their associations with plants. So certain fungal species have certain preferences about which plants they associate with, and they can maybe even favor like nutrient delivery to some plant species over others. So as I mentioned before, ectomycorrhizal fungi, for example, generally associate with slow-growing boreal trees, where arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi tend to prefer faster-growing species and maybe trees like in the tropics. And also in sort of grasslands, arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi in particular are involved a lot in the phosphorus cycling that takes place, and that allows like a larger diversity of plant species to exist. Also, fungi can act as a stress buffer for some plant species, so it's been shown that they can help plants deal better with stresses such as pests, but also stresses such as pollution and heavy metals in the soil. So again, this can sort of help create more diverse plant systems. So as I said, sort of the main benefit that plants acquire through mycorrhizal fungi, especially arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, is this increased nutrient content. So 80% of land species form association with arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, it's believed. This includes most nut and fruit trees, but also crops such as potato and carrot and cereals as well. So what basically happens in the soil is that if this is sort of representing the fungus here, it extends in the soil in areas where plant roots can't access, so it can get nutrients for the plant, and this can lead to better crops. Is the idea? Obviously, that depends on many other factors as well. Um, uh, but yeah, and this is an active area of research as well, because obviously of the applied implications of this, and a lot of farmers are interested in knowing whether we could use mycorrhizal fungi to reduce our resilience on synthetic fertilizers. So now I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about mycorrhizal networks, which I spoke about earlier. So the idea of a common mycorrhizal network, as I said, is the idea that plants are connected below ground by this fungal network. And so the lab experiments in this started actually in Sheffield back in the late 60s. But it wasn't until later, and specifically in 1997 here, where Canadian foresters showed plant carbon being transferred between trees, and this was done in natural settings. So it was very exciting at the time, and it led to this Nature publication, and it also led to the term Wood Wide Web being coined, which some of you might have heard. This gained popularity very quickly, and it's sort of the discovery was basically that mycorrhizal fungi can help interplant communication, potentially like signal and resource sharing. But this was debated, even at the time it was very much debated. And recently there's been like scientists coming together to dumb down a little bit some of the positivity and the public media outreach that has been happening. So specifically, they're questioning how widespread these common mycorrhizal networks are, and also if there is any resource sharing, how significant that is, particularly for plants, because so far, like, it seems like there are very small quantities of resource shared, if at all. Also quite troubling for the scientific community. They found like that there was a preferential citation of papers that showed positive effects of common mycorrhizal networks. So any research that didn't find these effects, they weren't cited as much. And also miscitations as well, in the sense that people were citing research, past research, to claim to sort of support a claim, but they were not remembering about the caveats of some of the technical limitations, but that the authors themselves had shared at the time. But mycorrhizal fungi do exist, and we do know that they do have important ecosystem important implications for our ecosystems. So one of them is that they do form a bridge between plants and soil, which means that they are important for carbon and nutrient cycling. So as I said before, mycorrhizal fungi receive a lot of carbon from the plants, and this is stored underground in the fungal network. So they are an important carbon pool. And recent research, including some Sheffield-based researchers, found that up to 13 gigatons of CO2 transferred by plants is at least temporarily stored in fungal networks below ground per year. So that equates to roughly 36% of global annual emissions from fossil fuels. So those scientists quite rightly sort of push for the idea that mycorrhizal fungi need to be better studied, their biology better included in global carbon models and so on, so we can better tackle and observe climate change. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about my work as well. So I spoke a lot about mycorrhizal fungi, which are generally thought to be beneficial for plants, but also obviously plants in nature don't just interact with mycorrhizal fungi, they interact with so many other organs, including bacteria and animals. So an animal that I'm interested in is a nematode. So there are many different types of nematodes. I particularly work with plant parasitic nematodes, which, as the name suggests, infect plants. And I also particularly work with potatoes as nematode, which is a pest for potatoes in the UK and worldwide. It leads to severe crop damages. So this is the juvenile feeding on the root that you can see here. And then when this sort of gets the resources out of the potato plant, and the females form into cysts, which contain hundreds of eggs, and they can persist in the soil for many, many years. And here you can see some of the damage that they cause on potato crops. So basically, the idea is that we set up experiments with different combinations of our vascular mycorrhizal fungi and nematodes to be able to sort of see who wins the competition for plant resources. Is it the fungus or is it the nematode? And also, can we use our vascular mycorrhizal fungi to help protect them against nematode infection? And this is showing the fungus colonizing the roots. The take-home message is yes and no. Sometimes we find that plants are doing better, but this can be a problem because also if the plant is happier, the nematodes are also happier. And we've seen that actually nematode populations that build and persist in the soils a little bit more than they would otherwise. But another important sort of research finding coming out from my experiments over the past year is also that to see this carbon cycling from the plant to the mycorrhizal fungi is actually influenced by the presence of nematodes as well, because I found that plants that are infected by nematodes tend to send less, in some cases, less carbon below ground, but also more importantly, the carbon that reaches the fungal network is then funneled away from the nematode infected plant. And then finally, just quickly, some knowledge gaps and sort of research frontiers on the mycorrhizal research in general. So we do know that mycorrhizal fungi are important for sort of plant nutrient uptake, and this has implications for like more sustainable agricultural practices and also forestry in many cases. But actually, we know very little about how these mycorrhizal fungi function. As I said, the diversity is very poorly described. We have more and more new species and new groupings being discovered, which might share some of the properties that we already know, but also quite possibly they might have unique properties. And so I suppose it's also very essential to try to conserve these fungi. They face threats from the usual suspects, such as land change, afforestation, pollution. Also, intensive agricultural practices can actually break down these fungal networks below ground and limit the capacity for these fungi to function and actually help us produce more food. And it's obviously important to preserve some of their diversity because we need to conserve that genetic diversity for potential biotechnological applications. For example, a common one is that they can be used as inocula to fertilize soil and then reduce our reliance on fertilizers, or as biocontrol agents to help plants do better with deal with pests. So yeah, I suppose thank you for listening. And if anything, regardless of whether the fact of whether mycorrhizal fungi can form a wood wide web or not, or whether they can help the mother tree, as that's another sort of common term that has come up, the mother tree being the tree that associates with mycorrhizal fungi and can share resources to its babies. It's something that people have used a lot as an idea to help popularize our research. But yeah, all of that is very debated. But regardless, I hope I've convinced you that their biology is still very interested and it merits more research and more conservation efforts. So there is the push to towards the term funga, which is sort of an equivalent to fauna and flora. And there's also organisms such as the Society for the Protection of Underground Networks, which is sort of trying to bridge the research and policy advocacy in order to sort of bring fungi and mycorrhizal fungi and soil in general under more of a spotlight, so we get better policies and sort of help protect and yeah, that's it. Thank you.